Well, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. So the Center for Causal Discovery is really a collaboration, as you can see on the bottom, almost, the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, and Yale University. So I wanted to just give you an outline. First, I'm going to talk about a brief background on causal discovery and causal network discovery to bring everybody on the same page. Some of you may well already know much of this. And the main point is that causal machine learning is just machine learning using causal models. The next point I want to make is to illustrate a method for causal discovery from observational data. And the point there is that it is possible to discover causal relationships from purely observational data. The third point is an example of a method that applies this to real biomedical data. And the point there is that these methods are already being used to analyze biomedical and clinical data and being published. And then finally, I want to give you a pointer to some software tools for causal network discovery that are free and open source. So I think we all agree that causal modeling and discovery are at the core of much of biomedical and clinical science and science in general. We want to understand mechanisms just out of our curiosity. We also are interested in predicting the results of interventions when we manipulate things. In particular, we want to understand how to control events. We want to understand how to maintain health. We want to understand how to cure disease. Examples are discovering clinical effects of a new drug or determining the genes and cell signaling pathways that cause breast cancer, or uncovering the mechanisms of pathogenicity of a recently mutated virus. The reasons why I think current circumstances favor causal network discovery from data are three. One is there's an abundance of biomedical and clinical data, and we've been talking about that, and we know that's the case, and that's increasing. The other is a dramatic increase in computing power that's available to us. And then third are the algorithmic advances in causal network discovery that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. The basic idea that we have in the Center for Causal Discovery, our basic philosophy, is that we have prior knowledge, and we've had three excellent talks in this session about prior knowledge and being able to get prior knowledge from the literature and other sources. We also have data. What we want to do is a causal analysis of those two to produce causal networks that then can inform scientists to help them form causal hypotheses that are likely to be true, interesting, and important. And then they would perform experiments to validate those. The results of those experiments then form new data and additional prior knowledge, and the cycle continues. So we don't see these algorithms as outputting the truth, but informing likely hypotheses on which experiments can be performed. There's different types of data, and of course, and two of the main types are experimental data, where we have controlled manipulation of some variables and then we observe other variables. And we have observational data where we just do observations with no manipulation. Electronic medical records are one good example of that observational data. And since it's the more challenging version, I'm going to focus on that for the rest of my talk. The basic components that are needed to learn causal networks from observational data are really three, and they're related to what we typically use in machine learning. We need a representation of causation, and we're going to use causal networks in this talk. We need a way of searching over that representation. And then as we search over that representation, we need a way of evaluating those models that we're searching over to find the ones that are the most probable given the data and the prior knowledge. So in terms of representation, we typically use causal Bayesian networks, but those are being extended. A CBN is a directed acyclic graph where the nodes represent variables in your domain, and the arcs represent direct causation relative to those variables. And a variable is modeled as independent of its non-effects given its causal parents. And let me unpack that with an example. This is a really simple example of that principle, where we have a variable A, B, and C. A causes B, B causes C. And what that principle says is that C is independent of A given that we condition on B. Because the only way A can affect C in this model is through B. And if we fix B, we condition on B, we're going to make A and C be independent. This structure implies a factorization of the joint probability distribution. So in these three variables, the joint of A, B, and C is the probability of A times the probability of B given A times the probability of C given B. And notice that last term when we condition on B and not on A and B because the model is telling us that C is independent of A given B. So we have a simpler, essentially the factorization is simpler than the full joint. There's several methods for learning these causal Bayesian networks from observational data, constraint-based, Bayesian, and there's some other ones more recently. I'm going to focus on constraint-based because it's the easiest one to convey to you intuitively in a short amount of time what's going on under the hood. So let's look at this. Basically what it does is it first has two steps. It first determines the constraints that hold among the variables. So those are typically independence constraints, like we might get from a chi-square test, that A is independent of C given B. And then it uses those patterns of constraints to narrow the causal possibilities as much as possible, and that's what it outputs. What are the causal possibilities consistent with those constraints? So let's make this concrete by looking at a simple example where we have three binary variables, x, y, and z. And we're going to assume, to make this a little bit more tractable in a short amount of time, that x occurs before y and x occurs before z. And we could, for example, have x being the gene mutation status for a given gene x. Y is the gene expression level for a given gene y. And z is the disease status, either present or absent. And our question is, does y cause z? We've got some data. We want to know, does y cause z? So let's suppose that we have a big data set on these three variables and we get these four constraints from the data that we're pretty confident in, and we could quantify that confidence. We find that x and y are dependent, that y and z are dependent, that x and z are dependent, and that, interestingly, x and z are independent given y. Okay? That's our data. That's the results of our data, of analyzing our data. So let's consider the consistency of these four constraints with respect to the following causal networks. This is one network that we're searching over. X causes y, and then we have basically no connection of x and y to z. Is this consistent with those four constraints? No. No, it's not. And just for time, I could ask you, but we have, in the data, we have that y and z are dependent, but this model doesn't provide any mechanism for y and z to be dependent. And I'm calling on your intuition about this, about causation, but we can make this mathematically rigorous. So we'll put an X by that. What about this one? No, for a very similar reason. Okay, the X and Y are dependent in the data, but this model doesn't provide any mechanism for X and Y to be dependent. What about this one? X causes Z and Z causes Y. Well, we have that X and Z are independent given Y from the data. That's one of the constraints. Here, we really wouldn't expect X and Z to be independent given Y, given that, that Y is basically just caused by Z. Okay, so this model doesn't support X and Z being independent given X and Z being independent given Y. What about this one? Well, we have the three dependencies we would expect from this model, pairwise dependencies. What about X, the independence, X and Z being independent given Y? Yeah, I see some people shaking their head up and down. Yes, we would, for the reasons that we talked about before when we were talking about A, B, and C. So we would expect that if we conditioned on Y, that X and Z would be independent if this really were the causal model among these three variables. And we don't have time to go through some other ones. H is a hidden variable here in the box. Even if we have this hidden variable causing X and Y, so they're confounded by H, we still get this fourth set of dependencies. And if we have H causing X and Y and X causing Y, we get the four constraints also. And then there's 90 other additional causal networks that we could enumerate. And it turns out that none of these satisfy all four tests. What do you see that's consistent among these three? It's similar. What's similar is that Y is causing Z, and there's no confounding of Y and Z. So if we get these 4 constraints, we can, it supports that Y is a cause of Z in an unconfounded fashion. Okay? So to summarize, what we did is we reduced a large number of causal network possibilities. In this case, there was just 96. In general, there could be billions or more of possibilities, just those networks consistent with the constraints obtaining the data. In this case, we got three that were consistent, 3 networks. And then it looks for the causal relationships that are common across those networks. So those 3 shared that Y causes Z in an unconfounded fashion. And the constraint-based discovery method generalizes to using many variables that have more complex patterns of constraints that support causal relationships than just 3, of course. So let me show you a real example. This was a study from Sweden with 354 rheumatoid arthritis cases and 337 controls. And X were basically SNPs that were measured. Y, and so there can be different values for X depending on the gene, the SNP. Y was differentiated methylation positions, and there can be many different types of variables Y depending on where you locate it. And then Z is rheumatoid arthritis status, and yes or no. So the core discovery algorithm is for all combinations of SNPs, that is for every possible SNP X, we can try different X's, and for every possible differential DMP Y, we would output Y causes Z in an unconfounded fashion whenever those 4 statistical tests hold. And that's what the authors did of this paper that's shown at the bottom that was published in Nature Biotechnology in 2013 by Liu and colleagues. The results were that they found 9 DMPs that the data support as causally influencing rheumatoid arthritis. And they didn't, at least in this paper, experimentally validate that in the lab, but what they did is they had another data set where they did validate it statistically on 24 additional cases, and they found that the changes in those 9 DMPs were consistent with the original study. So they found some consistency. So this is an example of just using this very simple technique. And there are more, as I said, there are more elaborate techniques that look for more complex patterns in the data. So let me just finish up by pointing you to the Center for Causal Discovery website shown here. And there are tutorials that that basically give our week-long course that give you much more material in detail than I have time to do here. And we have a set of free open source tools that you can use to do causal network discovery and put that into your own pipelines, as well as desktop application. And this is a good paper to look at for further literature that goes to the next level of detail. It's called Probabilistic Computational Causal Discovery for Systems Biology. And if you put this into Google Scholar, you'll find a PDF of this chapter that occurs in a book here. And I just wanted to then thank all the members of the Center for Causal Discovery for their contributions that I've been talking about, and of course acknowledge the NIH for their support. So thanks so much.
So we do have 2 minutes for questions. So if anybody would like to stand up, the center microphone still available? Okay.
Oh, I think there's a question right there.
So what's the connection to model randomization?
To what?
Model randomization.
To randomization?
Modeling randomization. So what's the word?
Modeling randomization?
Yeah.
What do you mean by modeling randomization?
So there are methods called modeling randomization or causal inference.
Okay.
So what's the connection between your approach to this?
I'm not familiar with that methodology, modeling randomization, so I'll have to find a pointer to that from you offline. If you can explain what it does, I can give you the contrast. But I'm not familiar with it.